Okay, let's talk about tests. Here, tests are run using Jest. If we look at the package.json scripts, we see that test runs turbo run test. Turbo is just a monorepo task runner, so it runs whatever command you want in all of the packages in the monorepo. So this is going to just run yarn test in all of these packages. So let's look at one of them, ESM pathology app, for example. In this package.json, when yarn test happens, it runs Jest and uses a particular Jest config. Our Jest config has a few important parts. They're important if you need to change them. The transform tells Jest how to interpret the different files. So we use SWC as a compiler. SWC is an alternative to Babel, and that is these are technologies for compiling modern fancy JavaScript into the kind of JavaScript that that can run in your browser or in Node or in Jest. So this is responsible for that transforming. This transform ignore patterns tells Jest what kinds of imports not to transform using SWC. So OpenMRS things will not be transformed. Cool. The module name mapper, this is one that you should actually, that you might actually have to mess with in the future, and so you should understand. This maps from imports to imports that will work in Jest. So for example, every time my code says import whatever from OpenMRS ESM framework, Jest transforms that to say import whatever it was from OpenMRS ESM framework /mock. So that's what the module name mapper does. Setup file, this just runs our setup script, and the test environment tells Jest how to run. We can take a look at this setup tests file, and this just initializes some testing library stuff that gives us access to fancier APIs for testing. And if we look at the test for this, we really ought to write some more robust tests for this app. But this is just like the absolute minimum test you can have. Just rendering the component and making sure that this doesn't produce an error. And if we cd into that directory, and we run yarn test, we see that indeed the pathology system renders without dying. Cool. Let's look at something more complicated. The oncology patient status app has some pretty real tests going on. At the top, we have a bunch of resources that are really worth reading and watching. Kinsey Dodds is like one of the he's a thought leader in testing, and is especially testing React and testing front-end apps. And so most of what he writes is like on the subject is really, really good. And these three things are worth reading in particular. Kinsey Dodds is also the inventor of Testing Library, which is a library we use. Let's look first at a non-React test. So we are testing this function choose next visit date obs, and this is just a function that takes some dates as input and then, or like an object containing dates as input, and then produces an object that also contains a date. Here there's a describe block, in which we say what we're testing. So we're testing the choose next visit date obs. And then there's these it blocks, which tell us like what we want to ensure is true. So the choose next visit date obs, it should choose the next future date. Okay, so we create some mock data. We pass that mock data into the function, giving us a result, and then we assert, we expect that the result value is a certain thing. So this is the general framework for any kind of testing. You have 3 phases. You have setup, creating mock data, preparing the system for testing, whatever. You have execution, where you actually, make whatever process you're testing, you make that happen. And then validation, which will, in Java, we use asserts. In React testing library with Jest, we use expect. And we have another test which follows the same structure. It's doing something, it's verifying something different, but similarly, it just sets up, executes, and asserts, expects. We have a couple of helper functions that we've defined in order to make this setup process cleaner. Okay, let's look at the meaty tests, the tests of patient status widget. So again, we have this sort of minimal test that it renders without dying. We have, in order to get this to work, we have to do some setup. We have to mock use SWR. Use SWR is something that we use for fetching data. So again, we set up, we execute, we assert. Okay, maybe it's time at this point to talk about mocks. Mocks are part of the Jest framework. So if you're looking for information about how to handle mocking in our testing system, you should be searching about Jest mocks, because this is all specific to Jest. So there's a few things going on here. We have this call jest.mock SWR. What this does is this tells Jest to replace the SWR module with a fake, with a mock. And so any imports from the SWR module will be Jest mocks. There's another syntax for this that allows you to actually specify what kind of things you want returned for each one. So we could, for example, say use SWR should be, we can, let's see. Oh wait, no, function. We could like include mocking information here in this when we call Jest mock to mock this thing. Or by default, its behavior is exactly this. But where use SWR can be anything, it'll be anything that we import from SWR. It'll just return jest.function. Okay, but we don't need this this mock factory argument right now. Okay, so we're mocking out SWR, and so that means we've imported use SWR from SWR here. Because of this line, jest.mock SWR, This thing, use SWR, is in fact a Jest mock. However, TypeScript doesn't know that. So use SWR, TypeScript thinks that use SWR is actually the real use SWR function from SWR. Okay? So in order to use mocking functions on it, in order to treat it as if it's a mock, we have to tell TypeScript that it is in fact a Jest mock. And so this line of code actually doesn't do anything in JavaScript terms. It doesn't change the execution of our application at all. All it does is it tells TypeScript, hey, use SWR, you can treat it as a Jest mock with the name mock use SWR. And so then we can call mock use SWR. We can use the mock functions on it, such as mock return value, so that every time, within the context of this test, every time use SWR gets called, it will return this empty SWR response, which is just this object, and this is just a helper function we've defined. Use SWR is used extensively in our application. It's always in this resource, in these resource functions. So here's an example. We call in use diagnosis, our component calls use diagnosis, and use diagnosis calls use SWR. When it's running in the test, our component will call use diagnosis, and then use SWR will return the mock data that we've provided to it. Cool. So let's get a little bit more complicated with it. We use SWR in multiple places. So here's a use SWR that is supposed to get the diagnosis, and it uses the program enrollment URL. Here is an instance of a call to use SWR that is supposed to get obs, and it calls obs and uses the concept UID in the URL. And then, okay, and that's used in both stage and treatment plan, but with different concept UIDs. Let's go back to the test. So how do we make it so that use SWR actually returns something different depending on what is being passed to it? In order to do that, we need to use the mock implementation function. Mock implementation, okay, so whereas mock return value says every time use SWR is called, return this value, mock implementation says every time use SWR is called, execute this function and return whatever this function returns. This function takes, just like use SWR, it takes a URL as the first argument, and then we are switching based on what the URL contains. We are returning a different mock value, just like we expect to happen in the browser. In the browser, when you access a different URL, you get different data. So that's that's what we're emulating here. And then when we render the patient status widget, use SWR is going to return the data, different data according to which URL was accessed. And then, so yeah, this is our execution step. And then our assertions. We look for things on the screen using React testing libraries query API. So we do screen, and we can do find by text, get by text, find by label, find by role. There's a million of them. And you just gotta consult the React testing library API documentation to learn more. But you start to get an understanding of it pretty quickly. And then we search for the closest div to this title element. We found this text, and now we find the closest div, and we expect that div is going to contain the text anal carcinoma. And we expect that, we expect that because anal carcinoma is part of the mock data that we're returning. This mock data is defined in this file resource.mocks.ts. And this we've just copied out of the network tab of the corresponding network request. So where it says mock program enrollment with diagnosis data, this data just comes from the browser. So if we're here, I open the browser console, I go to the network tab, and then just imagine that like this was the program enrollment URL. I would click this, go to response. Oh, come on, really? Okay. I need an actual response. Here we go. Okay. Let's say that this URL was the program enrollment URL. I go to response. I copy all this. And then I can just paste this into this mock file. And actually, let's see, what is this? This is the this is the endpoint patient. So this is the patient data for a particular patient. So I might call this export const mock patient data. And then I just paste. And then I can use, I can say use mock use SWR to return this fake patient data for a request to the patient URL. Cool. I think that covers quite a lot of it. So the really important, the really key things to remember are like the technologies that. One more thing that I want to touch on is that user event. So if you want to like make things happen in the app, you generally are going to use user event. We might need to. It might need to be. We might need to install it in this repository. But anyway, user event is a part of the React testing library that provides APIs like click. And so you can it allows you to, for example, click the treatment plan title. And so if you expected that to do something, you could click the treatment plan title and then like expect that the treatment plan title has gone away or whatever. Not to be not to be visible. Cool. Yeah. So again, the key technologies, the key terms to remember. Jest, which gives us describe, the expect framework, and React testing library. Jest also gives us the mocks. That's really important. React testing library gives us render, screen, fire event, user event, and the whole query structure. So find by whatever, get by whatever. Yeah. So these are the things to read about and understand. Okay, that's a 20-minute video, but hopefully we covered just about everything. Do you have any questions? Awesome. Okay.